We're here in Danbury. I want to thank, well, first of all, this is the first time in a policy forum that Nancy and I have been able to be together. It's a great honor to have Nancy Wyman as a running mate. No finer public servant exists in the state of Connecticut. And although we've been able to do campaign events together, we haven't been able to be together for a policy announcement, so this is a bit of a first for us. We're also joined by two absolutely fabulous state representatives who I'm very proud to be here with. And we have as a backdrop a Connecticut Works Department of Labor site, which actually is scheduled to close, believe it or not, in the worst economy that our country has experienced since the Great Depression, and an office that serves a large geographic area on administrative fiat by the governor, and this administration is to be closed, requiring that individuals needing services of this office will be required to travel to Waterbury in order to serve those, have those needs served. Now, I will remind people that Waterbury is a ways from here, number one. Number two, gas prices, although they've fallen, I don't know, 13, 14 cents in the last few weeks, are still mightily high, and requiring people needing the services here is just not a good idea. But that's a footnote, I suspect, to some of what we're trying to do. I'm presenting today a very extensive blueprint for turning the state around. It's based on personal experience as a mayor, as well as being actively involved in other roles in government. It brings to light some of my experience as an entrepreneur and as a practicing attorney. And it really calls on the state to change direction. Now, understand that Connecticut is dead last for job retention, not to speak of growth, dead last for job retention and job growth between the period of 1989 and 2008. Obviously, during that period of time, we had 3 direct state agencies involved in trying to formulate a policy. I want to be very clear. There is no economic development policy in the state of Connecticut, and when mine is adopted, it will be the first one we will have had in 20 years. It is a far-ranging program that calls for the coordination of efforts in job retention and job creation, creates investment vehicles, ways for the state to invest in new technologies, new jobs. It highlights something that we separately highlighted last week, and that is the necessity of changing the pricing with respect to utilities, electricity in particular, where we rank as the most expensive in the continental United States. It also touches on something that I know Nancy will touch on in just a few moments, and that's finding other ways to lower the cost of doing business in the state of Connecticut. You know, I want to say that very little of what's in this document is groundbreaking if you put it into context that every other state is doing some or many of the things that we call for. But in the state of Connecticut, we have failed to do that. And so I also want to be very clear that I consider the job of governor and the job of economic development to be one and the same. In our discussions, my discussions with Nancy Wyman, we've kind of talked about various areas that each of us would lead the charge on. Healthcare being one for Nancy, the reorganization of government being another. But I've also made it very clear that I intend to play a very large role in economic development, the setting of the priorities, the operation of our program, and quite frankly, making sure that that program evolves over an 8-year period of time to take into account the changes that do happen literally overnight in our economy. Now, we might forget that they happen overnight in the state of Connecticut because we don't change our approach to economic development, but every other state does. It also highlights the need to work with local governments on their economic development initiatives, and there's some fantastic ones in this state. in various parts of the state being led on a local level. I have experience of having done that in the south end of Stamford. I know the folks in Bridgeport talk about Steel Point. I know that New London has great efforts. I know that brownfield remediation would allow us to unlock some efforts here and elsewhere. I also know that the Norwich Hospital site represents some tremendous potentials. So we really are very much talking about changing the direction of the state of government, the state of Connecticut's government, when it comes to job growth. There are 12 specific points laid out in this document. When you have time to review them, I think you'll see that it is by far the most comprehensive document that any campaign has produced with respect to job growth. I did want to roll out last week energy because I thought it was the way to lead the job discussion. In the long run, we can't do a whole lot about job growth if we're not going to tackle the issue of cost of energy, particularly in the manufacturing sector. Now we lead with jobs and economic development, and we'll have other policy initiatives that will roll out in a little while. I'd love, Nancy, if you would, to talk about your part of cutting the cost of doing work.
The fact is that as we travel around the state, we talk to small businesses all the time. And we know that we have about 300,000 people in this state that have no health care coverage at all. Half of them, really, two out of three, are those that are working people. And most of them are working for small companies that cannot help them get health care. When we talk to the owners say the same thing. We cannot expand because we cannot afford to give health care to our employees. So Dan and I really believe in making health care accessible and affordable. We both have our ways of looking at business and seeing how we keep them together. Let me give you an example. Dan has always been an advocate for pooling. Well, we should be pooling these small businesses and letting them join together, not have them that they have to be individually rated, but as a large pool so that we can really bring down the cost. Right now in the state of Connecticut, they cannot do that. They cannot pool together. They have to be individually rated. We're doing that now for the municipalities. We're going to be doing that hopefully for businesses. The same thing we're trying to do for pharmacy. Their cost of pharmacy is way up. We've been able to cut the cost of pharmacy for that teacher retirement board, for municipalities that we're in the process of doing. We should be doing that for business. I find it amazing to me that this place is going to be closed when we need to have jobs retrained, people getting jobs, being able to find where to go to get jobs, how to write a resume. This is a place that we should be keeping open. This is not a cost savings. This will cost us in the long run. I just wanted to tell you that I really believe in Dan Malloy, and I know that Dan is going to be out there. Dan's experiences in Stamford, what he's done in Stamford, he's going to bring that throughout the state. And I'm glad that we can be partnering together to do that. So I'm going to turn it back to you.
Great.
Dan.
So the roadmap consists of 12 points, listening and leading, and we will display leadership. I particularly, as governor, will display leadership in this area. Use it, incentives that work. I want full disclosure of incentives. I want people to know what's being given, what's being produced, what the salaries are of the jobs that are being produced. I don't want to wipe out all incentives. I want to make sure that we benchmark all of our incentives and that we're not giving away money that is not accomplishing the task. But we do use incentives to make sure that we're competitive with other states. We want to be bold, and we want to think outside the box. And we want, as a state, to drive job creation. Working on a system to trade in research tax credits for the purposes of making bold investments in the state on facilities is something that I'm very interested in moving in the direction of. At the same time, also moving in the direction of seeing local and state pension plans enter into a Invest in Connecticut program, particularly along infrastructure lines and long-term investments with companies or companies that are making long-term investments in the state makes a lot of sense to us. Doubling our initiative in stem cell research is another area. Aggressively developing the state's water ports, and that may and also involve having serious discussions with the Longshoremen's Union on how to price the onloading and loading of those facilities is going to be important. Expanding on some work that's been done in the legislature with respect to Bradley International Airport, but also going beyond that substantially, as well as securing international flight status is very important. And also I highlighted in that point further investments well beyond the $368 million called for with respect to the Dempsey Yukon Center, really to move it in the direction of being a real research center that would be competitive for federal dollars and testing dollars, and would work in synergy with the medical complex that's been built up and around Yale University. We want to improve Connecticut's business climate. As many of you who cover me know, we need to lower the costs. We also need to make sure that everyone in government understands that time is money, something all of us learned in school, but some of us have forgotten. We want to succeed in recruiting business, something that I have been actively engaged in as mayor of the city of Stamford for 14 years. We want to compete for high technology, new technology, jobs, particularly in areas that we do already have a little bit of a leadership. It's interesting that here we are in Danbury, a community that does house some of the companies doing groundbreaking work in research with respect to alternative energy and more efficient energy. We want to redouble our efforts to revitalize manufacturing, again, very closely tied to energy, but other steps that we outline in the document. Make a real commitment to moving forward on brownfields. Again, if we want our urban areas to participate in a more robust economy, particularly one that will be competitive for manufacturing, it is incumbent upon us to set up a system that will see these brownfields cleaned up much more rapidly. Ultimately, I envision a $500 million fund on a revolving basis for brownfield remediation. We want to recognize and invest in women and minority-owned businesses. One of the proudest days as mayor was moving the Women's Business Development Center, which also advises minority businesses, into the Stamford Government Center as part of our economic development outreach to women and minority-owned businesses. We need to work hand in state government to do the same. We want to improve and enhance our infrastructure and transportation. Many people know the bridge collapse that occurred today while repairs were being made in Naugatuck. I'm sure there'll be much written about that. Connecticut needs better infrastructure. I certainly don't want to be a governor who turns over to the next generation infrastructure that's in worse shape than the infrastructure we inherited. Something that I talk about in all respects of government is instituting benchmark and greater accountability, benchmarking on an ongoing basis, and focus on workforce development and education, something that's very important to be talking about here, a higher level of coordination both through our pre-K through 12 schools, our community colleges, and other private and public colleges and universities. It's all fairly detailed in this document. We'll make it available to you. With that, I'd be happy to handle a few questions.
What if the president has called for increasing exports, doubling it over the next 5 years? What is governor can you do to increase the export market and create jobs?
Well, you know, it's a great point. We are an exporter of certain things, and not necessarily just products, but services as well. Building on our experience and leadership in certain areas, like insurance, would be helpful. But also understanding that we need to go after manufacturing to a greater degree and compete for what I know many scholars are now predicting to be a reindustrialization of America is going to be very important. One of the reasons that you can't reasonably predict that we would benefit is because we've been so bad at it over the last number of years. Energy costs. And then linking the idea that we could be exporting both products and in the energy arena itself seems to be something that we should be going after in a big way. Also look at some of our other strengths, biotech and bioscience, as we look to build those out. That would relate very strongly to doing major investments in the research end of the Dempsey Hospital, understanding that what the governor has largely called for with their $368 million is a remake of the beds. I want to remake research.
Would you like to do trade missions, China, Europe, things of that nature?
I think I think there is real value in doing that. I was, you know, I think you have to do the groundwork first. You have to understand what the potential is. You have to look for countries where you have a beginning, and then try to build on it.
So remaking the beds. Does that mean you don't support the Yukon project as far as you can figure?
You know what? I'll say to you what I've said to everybody so far. It is small thinking. Remaking the beds is about, there are some good parts of that, by the way. The trade-off of beds to other hospitals, therefore generating a larger number of beds at the site for clinical trials makes a lot of sense. But the real groundwork of turning that into a real clinical trial center and a research center is not included, in my opinion, in that proposal. It is too little, maybe too late, but it's certainly too little.
A lot of the job growth for the last 15 years has been entertainment related to two Native American casinos, continued expansion of ESPN. We have the production tax credit for them. Do you see that continuing, that growth?
You know, my belief in incentives, and I'll lay out a general rule. I'm not a big incentives guy, except or person. Excuse me.
That's okay.
I'm not a big incentives advocate, except that I understand that you have to level the playing field, or you have to design them in such a way to pick off an industry that you think is emerging. So if we're using it for an emerging industry, or we're using it to level the playing field, I'm all for incentives, as long as we measure the results and we disclose what the results are. That's very different than the current administration. So yeah, it very much could be part of it. So for instance, I'll just be very clear. Part of the R&D trade-in, I think, would be very helpful to companies that are investing, for instance, in new green technology, and particularly on the energy production side. So that's something I'm very interested in pursuing. Anyway, come back to you.
Stanford has benefited from some of those incentives, particularly on luring tenants across the border from New York, and some of them seem to, every 10 years or so, they go back and forth. So would you put an end to that? I mean, there was a company that recently relocated, moved to Stanford, or is in the process from Greenwich. Maybe was Nestle using some relocation dollars?
Nestle Waters, yeah.
So is that a bad use of the funds to relocate from Greenwich to...
You know, the thing about incentives, and I want to be very clear, because I've been on, you know, as mayor, I was on the winning and losing side of some of those battles. As you'll remember, Diageo moved to Norwalk. If you're truly expanding the tax base, and it's tied to expansion, it makes some sense. It's not tied to expansion. But not really. Then I think you have to start to question it, to tell you the truth. Now, I will tell you that Danbury, Stamford, Norwalk, Greenwich, communities that are along the New York border, we get real competition, and that's not necessarily understood anywhere. The folks in Westchester and other counties in New York are very aggressive about the programs, and more often that they're offering, and more often than not, the bulk of what Connecticut has done is to level the playing field with Westchester and New York City, but not always. And when you're talking about internal, in-state moves, I have a real problem with it. I had a problem with it in Diageo, and I certainly understand people having a problem with it elsewhere.
You know, there was last night I was at this meeting, and I had somebody come up to me and say, you know, my son has now been working for this company for 12 years. Small company of about 30 people, 40 people, and now they are being taken to Mexico, leaving all their jobs here, all the people here. And they were asked by New York and other states to come to them. Our state never asked, never came up and even talked to the owner to say, hey, we should be keeping the jobs here. Dan will do that. Dan has done that, about keeping jobs in our state. And I think that's something that we have to be talking about also, is making sure that these businesses know that we're open to listen, that we're open to see what we can do to keep them here, because those jobs are important to us. And Dan has proven that in Stanford, and I think we have to kind of look at that, of the record that he has in leadership on that. That's why the person was talking to me and saying, do you think Dan will do this? And I said, yeah, he has been doing it. But those are the things that we have to look at that we don't see happening now in the state at all.
It's also, and I just want to say this as a further answer to that, it's one of the reasons that I always stress in every discussion about government benchmarking, because it would be a lot easier to answer that question if we had a comparative document on what we're offering to other states. But that doesn't exist, Mark, and it would if I was governor. All right?
All the candidates are saying similar things as far as I will be a recruiter. I will, everybody has a story like the one that Nancy Wyman just
You know what the
told.
difference is?
What's it?
I've done it. I've done it. I've hosted receptions in New York City. I've gone into corporations to make the pitch. I've been on the phone with people out of the state. It took me 8 years to convince Target to build one of their first urban stores in Stamford. And yet we were one of the first 8 urban stores built in America by that corporation, 2 stores above 4 stories of parking. Starwood coming back to Connecticut. I had conversations with Starwood over a 6-year period of time while they were in Westchester County. I can point to that experience. I didn't buy them and move them. I didn't buy them and close them. I got them to move or open or expand or stay in Stamford. One of the misunderstood or ununderstood stories, even about UBS, is the restructuring of that deal was very much about keeping them in the state. After they had changed so much from the original Swiss bank, they gave serious thought to moving out of the state again. And yet we were able to keep them, expand the trading operation, and most recently their numbers have recovered very substantially, which is a good sign for Connecticut's economy. I do want to take a quick tour of the facility, if that's okay. Bamone is closing, but if you guys want to come with me, would that be okay?
Yes, sir.
Great. Okay. All right. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks everybody for being here. Thank you.